This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. The studio today is literally my car. The winds and pōneke today is unmatched, and so I'm hoping the car gives the right insulation. But if you're hearing a little background, just think of it as white noise. But thank you for tuning in to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This one is gonna be juicy, y'all. It's gonna be juicy because today we're talking about the quiet part of the beauty conversation that isn't often said out loud, but it is a message that is well understood and received. So, I have done episodes before about unpacking desirability, and how that is something that is a structure in itself. Who we find attractive, or who we find ourselves gravitating towards, can very much be influenced by the systems that we live in. Who gets seen and who gets chosen and who gets treated as valuable in a world obsessed with appearance. And another thing that we have also spoken about a lot on the podcast, but it is also a conversation that I see happening a lot in media, in real life, just happening all around, is pretty privilege, and how pretty privilege opens all these doors. But I think the other side of that coin when we are talking about pretty privilege is, for a lack of a better word, ugliness. But that feels slightly strange saying out loud, so I might use conventionally unattractive, but I'll switch between the two during this episode. But if you were to think about this coin and pretty privilege being on one side of that coin, then the other side of that coin is, like, for a lack of a better word, the opposite of privilege, maybe a curse? Gosh, I don't know. But like the conventionally unattractive curse. And that's something that we don't really talk about. And I understand, like, it is really, really uncomfortable. But it is something that I think is really important that we talk about. Now, let me just clear this up and get this stated in bold, capital, underlined statements before we really get into this episode. When I'm talking about like ugliness or like conventionally unattractiveness, I am not talking about calling people ugly. That is not what I'm meaning with this episode. What I'm meaning is beauty standards. Beauty standards, not specific people. I don't think it should be anyone's job on this God-given earth to be, deciding who is and who isn't ugly. That's wild and that is crazy. What I'm talking about here is interrogating the beauty standards that we have in this world, right? Because if there are beauty standards and the people who meet those beauty standards in whatever way, shape or form that comes in, because this is not like a binary. I feel like it's like a spectrum. And your proximity to those beauty standards in the spectrum, it dictates how, the pretty privilege that you have. And if you do not meet those beauty standards at all, and then the world will tell you, because you are going to acutely experience the opposite of pretty privilege. And I think that is the quiet part that we need to say out loud, because if we never talk about who constantly, like, for lack of a better word, loses, then that silence is part of the system itself. And if we are not talking, like, how can we ever change something if we don't even acknowledge it? And I think we need to be really clear about the silence and how it maintains the system and is part of the system. Because at the end of the day, you know, we're trying to ask the questions of who built these standards, who benefits from them, and what happens to those who don't fit. So with today's kōrero, I really want to talk about what it means to live on the other side of beauty, and what that means, like, socially and economically, emotionally, politically, all the things. So let's get into it. What is it, like, what do I mean when I'm saying conventionally unattractive, or, you know, quote unquote ugliness? And it's, as I said, you know, as I was saying before, when there is a beauty standard, or, you know, there's a dominant cultural beauty norm, and I'm talking about, like, body size and skin tone and hair texture and age and facial symmetry, and for the people who just don't fit those norms, have to deal with something called lookism, and it's, you know, that bias or discrimination based on how someone looks. And it sounds crazy saying this out loud, right? But it is a thing. Research and studies have shown that, you know, people who do have that pretty privilege, or who do meet those beauty standards, are more likely to be hired, paid more, and even described as more intelligent or kind. And studies have also shown that, you know, unattractive people are described with harsher traits, treated less warmly, and overlooked even when, you know, they are qualified. So it's not about it's not about what's not being beautiful. It's about being on the outside of what society rewards. And I think that is really, really important to understand, because that just goes to show it's not about the individual. It's not about a personal flaw. This is a social hierarchy, and with any other hierarchy, with any other system, with any other ism, there are winners, and then there are the people who quietly get punished by the system. And I think that is something that we really need to highlight: people who quietly get punished. And the thing about beauty standards is that it's not an objective or a neutral thing. They are, like, specifically and purposefully created and maintained by our systems. And I'm not saying that it's a rigid thing. It does shift. It very much depends on what, you know, on culture and time and power, you know, and in some era, there was an era where the curvy bodies were idealized, and another, thinness is the goal. I'm just thinking back to early 2000s. The thin was very much in. And in some cultures, you know, light skin is the prize. In others, it's delicate features and long hair. And when you are thinking about, like, beauty standards, you'll have to understand that it is very much tied to our other systems, like colonialism, class, race, gender. For example, Eurocentric beauty norms, which is, you know, the lighter skin tone, the smaller noses, the straight hair, that spread globally through colonial power and Western media. So those beauty standards, when you think about how they're shaped, how they're maintained, is really what we're talking about is cultural control. And the wild thing about that is how these standards, they impact us even from a really young age, before we even understand what any of these, terms mean, like lookism and, privilege and all of that kind of stuff. Like, from a young age, we learn that being attractive means being worthy, being loved and taken seriously and respected. And then because this is like a system that's just, as I was saying earlier, like it's a message that we have all received and understood, even if we don't say it out loud. And we get the story even from like a young age, which is why it's a little bit wild to me that when we do pick up this story, society can twist it back on us and call us vain, when especially like for young women, when we are told that being attractive means, you're more worthy and you'll be respected. And so then when you start thinking about or caring about or putting effort into said looks, society puts it back and says, oh, y'all are just being hella vain. It's like there's just no way to win. It's such a double bind, because we are told that beauty is the currency, and then when we try to spend that, we're ashamed. And so I think what I'm really trying to say is that the desire to be attractive, it's not shallow. It's often, most of the time, it's the desire to be respected or, to be seen. And I think that is really important to talk about, because it's very easy to shame and call that behavior as being vain. But it's like we are all like living in the system, and like even from a really young age, you just pick that up. You understand what's happening. It's so scary how young it is to like learn the script. And I know that I've just kind of been focusing on younger women, but I know that it's something that everyone in society deals with, that particular story. But I just, remember being younger, and I can't remember what age it was. Maybe it was like the end of primary school, definitely by the beginning of intermediate. Like, we were all acutely aware of this story. So, what happens when you are outside those beauty norms, and, you do pay the price in every single sense of the word, emotionally, economically, socially. People considered unattractive are often treated as less competent, less credible, less kind, and it shows up everywhere, in job interviews, in the dating world, who's believed in courtrooms and classrooms. And this system doesn't exist in a vacuum. If you are already marginalized for the other identities that you embody, being darker skinned, being fat, disabled, trans, or gender non-conforming, it like compounds. Like in the last episode, I was talking about how the intersectionality and how, for example, being a black woman, it's not like additive. in the sense that you have like double lack of privilege. It compounds, it amplifies. It's not something that can be separated from each other, and it's not like it's a double the effect times 2. It compounds. And so with that, there's this like invisibility and hypervisibility all at the same time. It's like at the same time you're completely invisible, or you're being seen too much for the wrong reasons, and you definitely internalize that, and it takes a lot of active effort to not absorb that story and make it mean something about who you are as a person. You know, you overcompensate in other ways by overachieving or being funny or shrinking yourself emotionally. So I think it's really important to understand that, again, that this is not just a personal individual experience. It is structural, and when we think about our beauty standards, they do uphold systems of exclusion. And just talking about all of this, it just makes me reflect on like my own journey with beauty standards and how that impacted me and how it impacts me now. I think now that I am a grown-ass woman, an adult, even though there are definitely still times where something real serious happens and I'm like, who's the adult in the room? Oh, snap, it's me. I am a grown-ass woman and I am an adult, and I have done a lot of work on myself on like reevaluating my relationship to beauty standards and reevaluating that relationship that I have with how I see myself. I think growing up, I mean, I feel like things are definitely different to what it was like when I was growing up. I think, you know, there's still a lot of room for improvement, do not get me wrong, but I feel like, you know, Muslim women, hijabis, you know, we on the up. It definitely wasn't like what it was like back in the day, where there was just like no example of a like an attractive or desirable hijabi or like a Muslim woman in mainstream media or in our culture. Like, it just really wasn't a thing. And now you're seeing more of that visibility in our media. So I feel like in that sense, you know, things have changed. All I'm trying to say is that it's just not the same landscape that I grew up in when I was younger compared to, like, you know, what the landscape of a young Muslim or a young hijabi now. And I'm not saying that all of a sudden, like, this is now the beauty standard. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But the landscape is different, and it is a little bit greener. Like, my landscape was just straight up desert. And I think growing up in a landscape like that, I very much internalized that story. But for whatever reason at that younger age, it was quite freeing for me, because I was just like, well, no one cares what I'm doing. No one is watching me in whatever way. Like, that's just not happening for me. So I'ma just do me. But even then, like, that sounds really empowering and freeing, but it wasn't, because I was doing me within the boundaries of, like, no one really respects me, I'm not really worthy. So, you know, it wasn't that freeing. And I think as I've gotten older, the distinctions that I've been able to make for myself, that has been quite freeing. I think what I've realized is that there, you know, this is the beauty standard. Here, you know, I don't really meet that beauty standard, but it doesn't actually mean that I am not, you know, it doesn't mean that I can't be beautiful. Those two things are very separate. I think growing up, I was like, the closest I get to the beauty standards, then I will be beautiful. But I think now I've just completely separated those two, because now I've really understood that beauty standards is a structural system, and it doesn't mean anything about who I am as a person. I am, you know, well, in my eyes anyway, I am beautiful, and that anyway, or, you know, even if I didn't think I was beautiful, that relationship that I have with myself should be developed and nurtured outside of that dynamic of my interactions with the system, because they are two different things. But the system and society will try to get you all twisted by making you feel like it's the same thing, and it is not. And let me tell you, I have been tested on that. And I have said this before on the show, you know, over I feel like the past 5 years of my life, I've been living in a bigger body. I am a fat woman, and that has been very interesting, because when you are fat, I feel like you are invisible but hyper visible all at the same time. Like, it's actually wild, the amount of comments that I get from strangers about my body. It is a really, really, really strange. Like, one time I was lining up in a cafe wanting to get you know, I just wanted to have a girly moment. I just wanted to have my matcha and a little sweet treat. And this old ass man was waiting in line too, and he was ahead of me, and you know, then he turned around. We both kind of were looking at the cabinet. I think we both were having the same moment of like, what little sweet treat am I going to have today? And we kind of caught eyes while we were both looking at the cabinet food options. And then he did ass. I really wish I could preface this by saying it was just a joke, or this was a dream. But he did ass, looks at me in the eye, pats his stomach, like miming mine, and it was like, oh, like, I'm not too sure you should be eating all of that. I was just so like gobsmacked and gagged and shocked. And also, I will say the quiet part out loud. I was embarrassed, and I did feel a lot of shame. You know what? I wish I could tell you if I remembered having that sweet treat or not still. But I genuinely cannot remember. My memory is just blank from that moment, because I was so shocked that he said that. And you could tell that he had no second thought about saying what he said, because he laughed, thinking it was like, what a funny joke, and then went about his day. It was so strange. And then the other day, someone absolute stranger. I need to preface this by saying I did not know this person. I'm sorry to this man. I did not know this man. This person said to me, "Oh, you're actually quite pretty, but your body is confusing because you look at your face and you would just never think you are as bottom heavy as you are." Again, absolutely gobsmacked that someone would feel very comfortable saying that to me. So it is so strange being invisible but hypervisible at the same time. It is so strange. But it is testing me. It is testing me on that work, because even through all of those weird interactions, and unfortunately there are many more, I'm still able to maintain this vacuum where I'm not going to let society or the systems or culture kind of seep into that relationship that I have with my body that is for me and me alone, to nurture that. And I'm not saying that it is easy to kind of maintain and protect this vacuum, because people be trifling. People be testing me. Society is testing me. But I am determined to maintain that vacuum because, bodies change. I have been skinnier before. What if my body changes and, I become skinnier again? I don't want to get any type of validation from now being closer to the beauty standards again, because the fact that doesn't change for me anyway, is that I am beautiful, and I don't want that to change, based on what society says or what the beauty standard says, because that's the thing. These beauty standards, they always change. I think that's what I was trying to say before about growing up in a different landscape to maybe younger people who are Muslim wearing a hijab now. Like, really, in the 2000s and the 2010s, like, wow, yeah, culture really said, you Muslim, you ugly. And I feel like now you're seeing like hijabi models, and there's just that visibility. And I think, there's still a long way to go. But, that has changed. And, if you told younger Amal, like teenage Amal, that the beauty standards would change from, just being thin, because I grew up in the early 2000s, I would be gobsmacked. I mean, it is interesting even then, like, these beauty standards which seem more progressive, it's interesting the conditions that are on it. Like, what I've noticed, like in the plus size world, is that, the plus size beauties that are like considered beautiful, they still have, like, this is going to sound really strange, but like the body proportions is still like, there's that proximity to that beauty standard there. Like, I don't often see a lot of plus size models who have, like that belly. It's, there's like curves. I've just noticed that, like, plus size means, you could be whatever, like, you could be bigger, but you still gotta have those curves. And not every plus size body looks like that, and I don't see that being celebrated. I feel like blackness, the culture has kind of changed in that sense, but even then, the the black beauty that you tend to see being celebrated in our society, there's still that proximity to the beauty standards, right? Whether it's like being light skinned or having features that are closer to that Eurocentric standard as opposed to like full lips and a full nose. So it is interesting that culture can change, but that's what I'm trying to say is I want my relationship with the way that I see myself and my body to be outside of that beauty standard, because A, it changes, B, it's a system that is based on exclusion and power, and I don't want my body to be put in that at all. And I think a really great example of like the politics of ugliness is Lena Dunham. And I'm not. That sounds. I said that out loud and I just realized how shady that sounds. Lena Dunham is a beautiful woman. I truly do believe that. But let's just rewind our minds back to 2012. Lena Dunham's show, Girls, it was a moment. It got a lot of attention for many reasons, but one of the key reasons that it got a lot of attention is that Lena Dunham was the main character of the show, and she didn't fit the usual beauty mold. Like, yes, she was white, but she wasn't conventionally thin or styled like the Hollywood norm. And she showed her body, her actual, normal, naked body on screen. And it was insane. The backlash was intense. And this show was being shown on HBO. And HBO is known for its like hella raunchy shows. There's a lot of nudity, so it's not like people were really bringing their pitchforks because of that. It was specifically because it was Lena Dunham's naked body that was being shown, and people were very comfortable saying these things out loud. They were like, her nudity was unpleasant, unflattering, unnecessary. I cannot remember who actually said this, but someone implied that Lena Dunham should be criminalized for showing her body. And so it wasn't that people weren't used to seeing a body that wasn't polished or sexualized being visible, but it was visible and being confident, because that was just that. Lena Dunham's character, and I suppose by extension Lena Dunham, there's that knowledge there of like not fitting the beauty standards, but heck, I'm going to like live my life and I'm still going to be the main character. And I think that was quite revolutionary. Like, that was quite revolutionary in itself. And so when you think about the reaction to Lena Dunham, what that moment showed, that it wasn't just about fat phobia, but how deeply uncomfortable our society is with bodies that challenge those desirability politics, right? Because with Lena Dunham kind of saying effort to the system, she was exposing that quiet part that we do not say out loud. And I never properly watched Girls, but I know that it had its own flaws because it was not very diverse, and it didn't speak to an experience that captured class. And a bit of a side tangent, I'm not saying that it had to be diverse, but I think it was presented in a way where it was like, this is the girlhood experience, but that's not all girls, or that doesn't capture the girlhood experience. Maybe for those of, maybe if you're a white woman or if you come from that particular class, maybe, but it isn't the girlhood experience for everyone. But I think one thing that show and Lena Dunham exposed was like that cultural discomfort. So, it's easy for us to say, like, we want real bodies on screen. But, when we actually see them, people have an uproar. They recoil. Like, it's... and I think, that's really interesting, because to me, what I'm picking up from what's being put down from people's reaction is that it's not just about what's valued, it's about what's allowed to exist visibly. And I know, just outside of the show, girls, there's a lot of problematic things with Lena Dunham. I know that people have a lot to say about Lena Dunham, and I haven't even gotten into all of those allegations, and so I'm not too sure, how truthful it is. But one thing that I will say is that whenever people have criticisms of Lena Dunham, they always bring her down with her body and how she looks, which is very interesting, because that shouldn't have anything to do with, what people are trying to criticize her for, what the allegations are about. But it's interesting that it's always brought up and to bring her down. And I think, again, that's just a symptom of the system that we live in. Now, there is this really interesting book, and it talks about all of this in probably more eloquent way than I have. But there's a book called Belly of the Beast: The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, and it really brings home the point about desirability. The author of the book, by the way, is Deshaun L. Harrison. And so Deshaun does a really good job of introducing this idea of desire capital, that desirability itself is a social currency, aka it is a form of power. It is something that you hold. So desire, in the book they write, desire capital determines who gains and holds both social and structural power, often predicated on anti-blackness, anti-fatness, cis-sexism, and queer antagonism. So, desirability, it's not just a personal thing. It's a power structure. So it's saying, it's deciding who gets treated with respect, whose lives are protected, whose pain is seen as tragic or justifiable. And in the book, Deshaun, argues that anti-fatness and anti-blackness are intertwined. Both are about controlling the body and disciplining what is acceptable. And I think the most radical and what was transformative for me, and this was like my golden nugget of the book, is how they redefine ugliness. And so, they say that being seen as quote unquote ugly, being outside these norms, can be a political stance. Because, it means you refuse to center your worth around systems designed to exclude you. And, I think that's pretty powerful. I think that's pretty rad, because it's transforming, quote unquote ugly from an insult into resistance. Now, y'all, this next little part of the episode, I need y'all to lock in. It's going to feel like we've gone back to school for a little bit, but I think this is the part that really ties everything together. So, the thesis statement is, lookism is an epistemic injustice. But don't skip. Don't quit out of the podcast now. I will break it down. So lookism, we mentioned it earlier, is discrimination based on appearance. And it is everywhere. It is in literally every context of life. It is in every aspect of life. It's, who gets hired, who's believed, who's loved. It is literally everywhere. And epistemic injustice is a term that was created by philosopher Miranda Frickler. And what it means is that you're being wronged as a knower. So it's when that bias makes people's voices, experiences, or knowledge less credible. And there's two types of injustices there. There's the testimonial injustice, when people aren't believed because of that bias or that discrimination. And I know I'm about to say this word incorrectly, but the hermeneutical injustice, and that is when society, we don't even have the words or the language to understand the experience of what it means to be ugly. So, that thesis statement, lookism is an epistemic injustice. We're saying that beauty standards don't just control who's desired, they control who's believed. And so if you're not conventionally attractive, people will see you as less competent, less trustworthy, less professional. Your truth carries less weight. And that's a testimonial injustice right there. But I think on a deeper level is that you are not seen as fully human. You have a bit of your humanity being stripped away from you because you're being dehumanized. People are really looking at you like that. And then I think the other injustice there is that there is not even the language to talk about this experience of being ugly by our society's beauty standards, because there is no shared vocabulary about, what it means to be quote unquote unattractive. Because if you think about it, when we do talk about pretty privilege, there is that knowledge, there is that shared vocabulary. It's relatively easy to talk about pretty privilege, identify who can access that pretty privilege. I feel like we as a society, we're very quick to be like, well, so-and-so has pretty privilege, whether we're talking about individuals or like groups of people, like for example, what comes to mind is the Victoria's Secret models, but only because they recently had their runaway show. But we're very quiet, and the conversation gets quiet and uncomfortable when we talking about the other side of the coin. And there is no shared vocabulary to talk about what it means to be unattractive. And that is, there's an injustice in that. And so lookism does not only shape social value, but it also gets to decide who gets to define the truth. And wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world where, this didn't even exist? Like, you could, regardless of what you looked like, it was just a neutral descriptor about who you are, and that was that. And that was that. But that is not the case at all. And so, what are we to do with all of this knowledge? And I think that is a very fair question, because it is a system that, we don't get to choose if we participate in the system. We do. And if you're not aware of that, then it's very easy for the system to tell you how you see yourself and how you see others. So, once you kind of see how that desirability politics works, you cannot unsee it. It absolutely changes how you see yourself and how you see others. I think, the moment when you really realize that beauty is cultural, it can be quite, freeing, but it is also, I acknowledge that it's also quite confronting because, it also, you have to grapple with the idea of like how we've internalized it all can come up too, like how we internalize attraction and how that attraction can be learnt and is not innate. Like if you think about dating, who do you find attractive? Who do you swipe left or right on? How, who do you label as not your type? And I'm not saying that this is the case for everyone, but it is interesting when you really think about it and you do the work, who you find attractive can, if you're not aware of it, your idea of what's attractive or what isn't attractive is how much of the hierarchy you've internalized. And, if you've internalized that hierarchy, you can understand that your preferences are not separate from other systems or isms like racism or fat phobia or ableism. They reflect them. And I'm not bringing this up to make y'all feel guilty about attraction because, you gonna like who you gonna like. You're gonna be attracted to who you're gonna be attracted to. You're gonna find someone beautiful for XYZ reasons. I'm not trying to make y'all feel guilty about that. But what I do want y'all to be is to be curious, because you need to be asking yourself, like, why or where did this idea of beauty come from? And I think this, internalized hierarchy, not only does it impact how we see other people, but it also can impact how we see ourselves and how we see our own self-image. And I think it can help us, detach from that lie of like our worth is visual, because if that story is true, is part of that wider story and that wider system. But once you realize that that isn't the case at all, the system has less of a grip on you. You're not in the same kind of chokehold. And so we can start to build that relationships with our relationships. What am I trying to say? You're going to have a relationship with yourself. But you can build a relationship with yourself that isn't, that's outside of that system or that story or that beauty standard. And, that story and that relationship can be based on integrity and curiosity and care and respect. And I think when we consciously unlearn those desirability hierarchies, we start to see, people and ourselves as full humans and not just like, being ranked on a spectrum and who is the closest to like the beauty standard. I think that is liberation. So, why is this conversation about ugliness so uncomfortable, and why do we avoid it? Because, it does feel, and it's something that I've just this whole episode saying the word ugly, every single time I've said it, I felt it in my body. But it does feel cruel to say ugly or unattractive. And I think it's much easier to talk about privilege than it is to talk about penalty. Because, we're just told it's quote unquote just preference, but avoiding it doesn't make it go away, and it just makes that bias invisible. And what does that invisibility do, y'all? It protects the power. And so we can't dismantle what we refuse to name. And I think that is the crux of it all. And that's the real reason why I really, really wanted to have a corridor about this on the show. Because invisibility always protects the power. So, what have we just been talking about? We looked at the other side of the coin today, and we're talking about what it means to exist outside of those conventional beauty standards. And we've unpacked lookism, beauty as a culture, how these systems shape our relationships, our credibility, and our ability to be seen. And, one thing that I really, really wanted to end this episode saying is that if you've ever felt unseen or undesirable, please remember, you are not the problem. The standard is. And I think when we name those dynamics, they most absolutely loosen their grip. We make space for beauty that isn't conditional, for self-worth that isn't hierarchical, and for love that isn't filtered through bias. And I think that is really, really important that we acknowledge that. And I just share just a little anecdote. I was talking about this with a friend several months ago now, but now that I'm recording this episode, it's like come to mind. And this friend of mine, they live in a bigger body. They are a black woman. To me, they are beautiful. They are just chef's kiss. Like, literally every time I just, sometimes whenever we hang out, I look at them and I'm like, God damn, you're so pretty. But we were talking about how she was having this conversation with some of her friends, some of her homegirls, and they were talking about desirability and all of that kind of stuff, and they were really, like, she had to call them out because they were really uncomfortable to say this is how I, these are the ways in which I am not desirable. And she had to be like, yo, I've literally been with you when I've seen that pretty privilege in action. Like, they were very hesitant to claim that pretty privilege, and she has like a rock solid relationship with these girls, and they were able to get to the bottom of it. And at the end of the day, what the nugget of the conversation was that the girls felt uncomfortable claiming that pretty privilege because the quiet part that wasn't being said out loud is that they were aware of my friend and how she, there are certain ways that she doesn't meet the beauty standards. And it's kind of that thing again where there isn't that shared vocabulary to talk about what it means to be considered conventionally unattractive. And I think that invisibility but hypervisibility at the same time just like reinforced that structure. And so I think it's really important that we do talk about this, because these really uncomfortable and honest conversations is how we do shift culture. So thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I hope y'all have enjoyed it and have some golden nuggets. Take care, and we'll catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.